The psychoanalyst Eric Fr., in one of his texts, tells the story of a man who aspired to become a talented fiction writer. However, internal resistances prevented him from sitting down and writing his fictional stories. He justified his perpetual procrastination with what Eric Fr. called the belief in time, meaning he kept telling himself that one day he would start working, but, as often happens, that day never came. And when he reached middle age and death was drawing nearer, the man realized how much time and energy he had wasted, which ultimately led to a mental breakdown. Eric Fr. continues, "In reality, he still hadn't written a single line. The older these people become, the more they cling to the illusion that one day they will do something. For certain people, upon reaching a certain age, usually in their early 40s, a neurotic choler appears, based on the fact that one cannot live without that comforting illusion of time. For some, laziness is the main obstacle that prevents them from realizing their creative potential, but others claim that fear is the primary resistance to creativity, and that laziness is just an external manifestation of underlying fears. In the book, The War of Art, the writer Stephen Pressfield shows us that it is fear, but resistance is too clever to reveal itself so openly. Instead of showing our fear, which could embarrass us and push us to do our work, resistance presents us with a series of plausible and rational justifications for why we don't do what we must do. The fear of working hard on something can manifest itself as laziness, or the fear of not being smart or talented enough to create something valuable. These two aspects of fear communicate with each other and prevent us from starting something. There's an almost unconscious line of thought that runs through our mind. Something like this: I've visualized a project. It's perfect, but I'm afraid of bringing it to life because I know I won't be capable enough to leave it as I imagined. When we first think about creating something, we tend to inflate ourselves psychologically and emotionally and get carried away by unrealistic enthusiasm. We overestimate our idea, imagine how glorious our final product will be, and assume that the creative process will come with relative ease. This creative inflation is a normal and necessary part of the creative process, as the enthusiasm associated with it helps us overcome our fears and laziness and dedicate ourselves to the difficult creative work. However, many times, when turning an idea into reality, something in this process can make it seem smaller. We move from the transcendent to the mundane, and we begin to perceive the flaws and limitations of our creations. This is called creative deflation, which is the inevitable disappointment we feel when our final creative product isn't as good as we originally imagined. It often happens that after completing a work, we feel afraid to do the next one or even to continue the one we were doing precisely because of creative deflation. However, looking back, we will almost certainly regret not having acted on our creative aspirations. But we must realize that creativity is the ability to transform flaws or doubts into art. Art is humanity materialized. If we were like machines, art wouldn't exist, as it wouldn't have a soul. We can ask an AI to create fine art for us, but it won't have humanity. To turn an idea into reality, we must channel it through our clumsy creative abilities, subjecting them to the limitations of our creative tools and downgrading them with our own imperfections and blind spots. It's not easy to endure creative deflation and accept that with each creation, there will be an abyss between our original vision and the final product. This is why most people with creative aspirations never realize them. Many prefer to go through life with great creative ideas that remain unrealized rather than start working and risk creating something tangible that may not be as good as planned. An example of this is shown in one of Machado de Asis's stories, called The Famous Man. In the story, a musician named Pestana has a great desire to immortalize himself with compositions as good as Beethoven's and Mozart's, which consequently prevents him from working on simpler projects that would ensure his livelihood. What happens is that Pestana built a fixed ideal of perfection, overestimating his importance and constantly comparing his achievements to the idea of being a genius or a perfect, cultured human being. It is precisely that comparison that makes him think that his compositions are never up to what he imagined. But this had a cost even for those around him, as Pestana began to attribute his failure to external circumstances. After making countless attempts to turn his desire to be a great composer into reality, he even married a composer, thinking that it would bring him inspiration. But, as expected, he couldn't overcome his lack of creativity. In the end, he became ill. One of the worst things that can happen is not to use that creative energy. As the Jungian therapist Marie-Louise von Franz wrote, "People who have a creative side and don't live it are the most unpleasant clients. They make a storm in a teacup, worry about unnecessary things, fall too much in love with someone who doesn't deserve that much attention, and so on. There is a floating burden of energy in them that is not linked to their true goal. So they tend to apply that energy in the wrong situations. When we fail to channel our creative energy, it doesn't disappear completely. Instead, it gets trapped inside us, and when stagnant, it becomes destructive, pushing us to vent our creative frustrations on others or even to succumb to vices to find temporary relief from the chronic stress caused by repressed creative energy. One of the most effective ways to deal with this creative deflation, like what happened with Pestana, is to, instead of working on a single creative project that we spend years trying to transform into a masterpiece, attempt to work on a larger number of smaller projects. When we deal with smaller projects, it's easier to experiment, take risks, and see each creation as a learning experience and a true creative laboratory to hone our skills. Moreover, when other creative projects are waiting in our queue, we don't have time to brood over the disappointment of our creative deflation. After doing the best we can and finishing a project, we feel eager to release it and set it aside so we can move on to the next one. And that's exactly what often needs to happen. We need to let our works happen and not hold them within us in our thoughts. Valuing only grand achievements causes disillusionment with life, which is precisely made of small things built one day at a time. It is true that when creating several works, many of them will be inevitable. And once again, it's not easy to endure creative deflation and realize that nothing we create in this world can be perfect. We are fallible, and therefore our creations will be fallible. It would not be coherent to expect perfect creations from limited beings, but that doesn't stop us from aspiring to great things, as long as they are achievable. To give our worldly success the best chance, we must update our creative potential. This can only be done if our primary motivations for creating ignite the desire for success at any cost, whether financial or in other worldly areas. Many times, it's the fact that our motivations are in the wrong place that prevents us from channeling our creative energy to produce our projects. The final issue is this: Many don't want to go through this process that can be painful but transformative, and prefer to remain their whole lives as aspiring artists or aspiring geniuses on a very large scale, rather than being producers of a simpler product on a much smaller yet achievable scale, which would even give them the capacity to create great works. We should not wait for inspiration to fall from the sky, nor be afraid to materialize what we visualize in our minds, because in the end, we don't want to end up like Pastana. He passed away the next morning at 4:05 a.m., well with others, but poorly with himself.